Morning at Properties. It's Thursday, May 14th, and it's a stormy one out there. I'm Amy Corr, and I'm joined by Kevin Van Eck, who's live out of our Goose Island office. And we're excited to be back for another episode of Coffee with Amy and Kevin.
Yes, good morning, everyone. It appears like it's monsoon season here in Chicago. So thank you for joining us. Hopefully you have your coffee. Today, we're going to be covering some of the questions that you had sent to us. Earlier this week, we'd asked for some challenges that you're having in terms of conversion and getting commitment, and we got a whole slew of questions, which is really great. So we chose some of those that we felt were most impactful that we could all learn from. So we're going to share some of our thoughts and answers to these situations and questions that you sent in so we can all improve.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So wanted to jump right into these. The first one that we had is a really good one, and I think it comes up a lot. It's not knowing, feeling like you don't know as much as a seasoned broker would, and how do I learn and how do I feel confident, moving forward in the business if I am, essentially newer. And, that happens to all of us. Let's face it. We were all new in the business at one point in time. And, one of the best experiences I had, and I call it the best, even though it was a moment of failure for me, but I really learned from it in real estate was when I first got into the business. I moved to Ad Properties in 2004. It was probably I was in the business for about a year and a half, but I had an opportunity to go on a listing presentation. And up until that point, I had only worked with buyers. So I was really excited, but I was really nervous. And so I did a lot of research, and this was for a house in Bucktown. And it was actually a referral from an attorney that I had been working with. So really important for me to do a good job. And so I did a lot of research. I put together what I thought was a good listing presentation. And before I went on the appointment, I actually decided to connect with a really seasoned broker in my office. Many of you may know her, Linda Brasnowski. She's a rock star, and she still is. But she had been selling for years, and she knew Bucktown really well. And so I decided to just ask her if she could help give me some thoughts on Bucktown and the single-family homes there, pricing. And she was gracious enough to sit down and spend a lot of time with me. So I felt pretty prepared, and I went on the listing presentation, and I won't bore you with all the details, but I did everything wrong. I went into the house, and I walked in, and I think my jaw dropped because it was an upside down house, which at the time I didn't even really know what that was. But I walked into the house, and the main level was all the living area, but then all the bedrooms were downstairs. So there was not that traditional upstairs 3 bedrooms. So already walking in there, I thought, oh, okay, I'm not really sure how I'm going to do this. But I laid out my presentation, and I gave them pricing right on the spot. This was my first appointment with them. So just to wrap it up, I didn't get the opportunity. And I walked out of there, and I was really bummed. But it was a really big lesson for me. What I had recognized at that time is, had I paid for experience and for the opportunity to learn from somebody who really knew that market, I maybe would have actually gotten that opportunity. So in taking a step back, what I probably would have told myself had I done it again is, instead of just asking for Linda's advice, which she was really so gracious enough to give, I would have approached her maybe and said, listen, Linda, I know you're really experienced in Bucktown. I've got this listing opportunity. I really want to get it. And I think the best thing might be if I partner with somebody who knows more about it. And had I had Linda come in, yes, I probably would have shared my commission, but just think about what I would have been paying for. I would have been paying for live experience. I would have been able to see Linda sitting down and actually going through a live listing presentation and being able to show me how to do what I needed to do to be successful. And instead, I came out without the opportunity, not gaining a listing and, not gaining a commission. So it was a big learning moment for me, where I also had to recognize that in order to grow in this business, I'm not going to be able to do it in a silo. You need to ask for help. You need to reach out to your managing brokers. You need to recognize it's okay to collaborate with your colleagues. This isn't always such a competitive, cutthroat situation, especially at, not at all. There's a lot of collaboration. And so I think as you're growing and as you are a newer broker, look for opportunities to align yourself with people who know more than you. While you may not, from a financial standpoint, gain, all of, what you could get if you were doing it on your own, you have to realize you may not have gotten the opportunity then anyway. So, take that mind shift. And if you don't know who to go to, reach out to your managing broker. There's lots of great ways for us to really help you grow. And Kev, I don't know if you want to add on. I think you've got some stuff to add for it as well.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I mean, it pays to pay for experience, right? So think about it. Because I had the same scenario where in the first, call it 6 months of my business, I was with a different brokerage. And there was no engagement, no training. There were 6 brokers in total at the small brokerage in Lakeview. And I blew it 100% of the time for my first 6 months. I didn't get any, I had opportunities where I could have gotten a listing, I could have worked with a buyer, but I did all of the wrong things. And looking back, when I came to Ad Properties, it changed because there were resources, there were people. I was working with a great Ad Properties broker who's still with us, Brian Grossman, and his team at the time. So I had a lot of support then. But prior to that, had I, looking back, I would have found anybody to go in. And this story isn't just for, newer brokers. I think this also applies to experienced brokers, because we see it with experienced brokers. If they take a listing that they're not comfortable with, that maybe isn't in their wheelhouse, whether it's a multi-unit, a multi-family, whether it's in a neighborhood they normally don't operate within, you see experienced brokers co-listing and working together all the time. So I think this applies across the board, regardless of experience level, because again, getting the listing, getting the business is more important than not, right? Zero is zero. So if you go in and try and wing it and you don't know what you're doing, you don't know what you're saying, you don't have the experience, bring someone in who does.
Yeah, and there's one other thing I wanted to add as well, because you might be in a position where you've been doing this for a few years and you're pretty good at it, and you don't necessarily feel like, I need to bring somebody in to get the business. But you are in positions sometimes where you're up against a more seasoned broker who does more in the neighborhood, who's been doing this longer, just has a better track record when you look at numbers. There's a lot of us that run into that. And what I would also encourage you to focus on is the idea of your offering is quality over quantity. A big broker does a quantity of business. They've got a ton of listings. They've got, great stats, but they are a machine. And so when you think about, the volume or the quantity of listings that they have, how much attention can they pay to each individual buyer or seller? So what you can do is, what is your value proposition? Your value could really shift to, listen, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I really focus on quality over quantity when it comes to my business. And what I mean by that is that I want to make sure that I take X amount of listings at a time, because I want to make sure that you get all of me, because I want to be the one that takes you through this entire process from A to Z, because you're hiring me and I want to make sure that you get me. So, my whole focus in my business is I take on as much as I can to make sure that you have the ultimate client experience. So that changes the shift. And you can even articulate how others really might focus on quantity. And while they, do a lot in the neighborhood, they may not, given their size, have the opportunity to have as much of a hands-on one-on-one opportunity with them. So a lot of it is just shifting your value proposition to it being the positive. And the last thing I will say is that I am a big believer that any newer broker can out-hustle a seasoned broker. You have the time and the energy to do the little things, to drop off the note card after your first conversation, to get them a small little gift or some sort of token after the walkthrough. Do the little things that you can do right now while you have the time, because once your business does take off, that does get harder and harder. So just know that you can compete. The confidence comes from the inside, but you can absolutely do it.
Yeah, and that's not to say that those with a lot of listings and those of you with, bigger teams aren't successful and don't have a value proposition. In sales, you can pitch one thing any number of ways. So for those of you with big teams, the advantage is that you do have a team, that you have, this process down that maybe other brokers don't, that you can walk your clients through clearly exactly what's going to happen. So, there's value in, regardless of whether you're newer, one person, or whether you're experienced, with a lot of volume, a lot of success, and multiple people on your team. So let's go to the second question. The second question that we'd received was about scripts. And we know, especially this week, we've sent out a lot of scripts in terms of, whether they're from the perfect listing presentation and they're revolving around commission and price, and, or yesterday we talked about the scripts to be able to use for the tools. the specific question was, how do we go about learning all of these scripts, and how do we use them, because there are a lot. So my suggestion for that is to go in chronological order of how a transaction or an interaction may work. And so what I mean by that is, one of the parts of the perfect listing presentation is the initial phone call. And that was typically your first interaction with somebody. If you blow that, you may blow the opportunity to go further with that person, with that prospect. So I would suggest starting with a script with that initial phone call, because if you can solidify that and you practice that and you have that down, that sets the tone and really increases the odds that you're going to be able to capture the business down the road. So my suggestion, there are a lot of scripts out there. I would start with the very beginning interaction with a potential client and then work down the road, because again, you don't need to learn the pricing dialogues if you don't have any listing presentations to give.
Yeah, really good advice, Kevin. And I think you're right on with that. The other question that we did get was about asking acquaintances for business or talking to them without feeling really salesy. And that kind of dovetails into, another question that we combined into this, which is the fear of friends feeling like they're trying to be sold. So here's what I'm going to say. Then don't try to sell them. You have to recognize that in this business, what do we talk about it at Properties? That we focus on relationships first, and really the rest of the business takes care of itself. And so you really have to think about that when it comes to your sphere of influence, even your past clients. And I think especially now, as we've gone through COVID-19, now more than ever, I think we're recognizing the value of relationships and focusing on those first. And Kevin and I have been saying, if you focus on those first, the business will follow. I really think the same is true when you're talking with acquaintances. I was telling Kevin earlier, my husband used to say to me when we would go to dinner parties or out with friends, he would always say, gosh, will you not talk about business tonight? And I would never lead with business, but what he meant by that is that ultimately people would always ask me. And it was always without a doubt, even if I went into an evening and I knew that I was going to try really hard not to bring up work, ultimately, after having a really good, authentic conversation, it came up. Because these are acquaintances or friends, who people who know us. And, when we start asking them forward questions, which, is obviously from Ninja, but where we really talk about getting to know people and asking about them, most of the time they want to reciprocate back. And so they start asking us questions about life and family and, of course, about occupation. So it really comes naturally. So what I would say to you is don't go into an evening or an appointment or a time with friends or acquaintances and think about, when am I going to drop that ask? Do you have any friends or family who are thinking about buying or selling? Take that off the plate. Take that off the table. Go in and think about having a really authentic, great time with them. And what's going to end up happening is the conversation about real estate will eventually evolve. Now, the important thing is when they do ask you anything, you want to be ready. You want to know your stuff and make sure that, you are able to answer anything they ask about real estate. When I moved from the city to the suburbs, it was a big transition for me. I was getting into a new market and I was trying to meet new friends. And I felt really uncomfortable. I just had Molly, my oldest daughter, and I was meeting a lot of new moms. And I didn't want them to feel like I was that realtor mom where all I wanted to do was talk about real estate. So I actually said to myself, I'm going to take it off the table. I'm not going to even talk about real estate. But what I did do is whenever they asked me to go somewhere or meet them at the park, I would always say yes. And I would do two things. I would always say, you know what, I'm going to be wrapping up with a client and I'm going to grab Molly from daycare and I might be a few minutes late to meet you at 3 o'clock. So what I did right there is indirectly let them know that I took my real estate really seriously and that I was in real estate. And then what I would do is I would show up and I would be dressed up, not over the top, but instead of in Lululemons or in sweats or something, I'd be in jeans and a blazer, still able to be active at the park, but just to sort of show them that I took my job seriously. And I will tell you, that's all I needed to do. They would start inquiring and asking me about work, and it ultimately evolved into great opportunity over time. So I would just say, don't push it too hard. Just focus on being authentic, be yourself, try to get to know people, and honestly, the rest will take care of itself.
Yeah, agreed, Amy. I think the authenticity is the key, because a lot of times we hear, and even in this question, it mentioned that this broker's friend group were talking about a different agent, and they were talking about how that agent was effectively salesy. And, what that leads me to believe, and from experience and seeing how we all operate and how brokers communicate with people, it feels like, when people know when you're not being authentic, people know when you're being salesy and you have an agenda. And so that's why they were talking about this other broker. Now, everybody has, they get business in different ways. But in this specific scenario, they didn't feel that broker was being authentic. So if you lead with the relationship, that's the win. And to Amy's point, if you go out to dinner with somebody, if you're out with a group, one way that I think about it is, how can I learn more about everyone around the table? What questions can I ask to learn more? And that keeps me from wanting to push information. And remember, there are times, whether it's about real estate or you just went on a great vacation, there are times when you look back, you were with somebody, and what did I do? I filibustered them about my trip to somewhere for 5 minutes, when probably they didn't care. But I was so excited to share that information, and it was a missed opportunity to learn more about them and really become closer and make them feel great by asking questions. So going in with a relationship is always the best way to do it. And then you won't be salesy and you won't feel salesy. So I think the one other thing that we wanted to add there, Amy, we've been talking about, brokers. When you're around other brokers and you're around people and you hear negativity being spoken in general, but specifically about other agents. What were you mentioning about that?
Yeah, I think that this is really important, and I've just seen it in my own experience over the years. I would always say that whenever there is dialogue or conversation about a colleague, or even if there is somebody who is working with somebody, currently, but they might be asking you questions, I think it's always so important to take the high road and respect your colleagues. Like, if someone is already in a relationship with them, it never pays to talk negatively about another broker. Even if you feel on the inside that, they're not, they don't do business as well as you do, I think we need to protect our craft and the fact that we are all brokers who are working really hard. So I just think being mindful when you are in dialogue with acquaintances and other names in real estate may come up. It's just about always taking the high road and just making sure that we're really respectful of our other colleagues out there. I think that just is so important. And Kevin, you and I were just talking about that earlier.
Yeah, agreed. So the last question that we have is another one. And I think we all have some level of fear of rejection, right? Internally within us, we want to be liked. We want to be accepted. We want people to engage with us and be attracted to us and all these things. So naturally, we all have a fear of rejection. But I think when we talk about fear of rejection, it typically means that we're going into an opportunity and we're so afraid that we're not going to get it that it psychs us out, that it really impacts how confident we are. It impacts our performance, whatever it might be, meaning, you go into a listing presentation and you're flubbing words and you're misspeaking about data and what you do as a broker in your process. Let's not psych ourselves out. I think one of the ways that I do it to eliminate that fear of rejection is to shift the power. So I know when I was going into a listing presentation, I viewed it as I was really interviewing them. And whether, right to Thad's point about sitting in a car outside of a listing presentation or on the way to that meeting, that's what I would tell myself. I would say, I'm actually interviewing them because I may not want this listing. I may not want to work with these people. They may not be realistic about price. They may try and shake me down for commission. And so I went into it like it was a mutual interview. I may not want to work with them. And that shifted the power, so I wasn't so afraid. The other thing I would do, and I actually got this from a book, and forgive me, I can't remember the name of the book, but it's really about writing out, okay, what is the best possible outcome and what is the worst possible outcome? And when you write those down, you realize that the worst possible outcome is not that bad. You just don't get the listing. And the way I would look at that then is it's an opportunity then to continue working on business development. It was an opportunity to work with other people and get more business instead of, working with those people who either chose not to work with me or I didn't work with them. So I think the last thing I would add is with rejection, it's almost, I almost rewarded myself for rejection to put myself in, in opportunities that maybe weren't slam dunks, to put myself out there. And there was something that I got actually from licensing school when I took my licensing course at Corr. And one of the last things the instructor said, and I don't remember his name, but it has stuck with me all of these years. One of the last things he said when we finished the class and finished the course was, celebrate when you lose. Celebrate when you are rejected. Celebrate when you don't get the listing, when the closing falls apart. Because when you win, When you close something great, when you get a $25,000 commission check, when you sell your first $1 million property, you're high already. You're emotionally riding high. So one of the things that we have to do is build ourselves back up after rejection to get back up and do it again. And that was something that always stuck with me in terms of when I got rejected, I knew that there was a stake waiting for me on the other side. So it would encourage me to take risks, do things that I, put myself in situations that maybe I was uncomfortable with and get past the fear of rejection.
Yeah, I think that's so important because, I think the idea is that if you are never hearing no, then in my mind, you're not pushing yourself hard enough. It means you're not getting outside of your comfort zone. And, I think all of us, Kevin, you talked about what your sort of internal dialogue was before you walked through the doors of sitting down with a buyer or seller for an interview. I think all of us have had to do that. And, I've been doing it my whole life before even getting into real estate. I was saying to Kevin earlier, when I used to be in corporate America and I would have to go on interviews and some of them weren't so easy. I flundered a lot of them. But what I also recognized is the ones that I did extremely well on were the ones that I didn't want that bad because I didn't really care. And not to say that you should go into listing presentations not caring, but I would talk myself into the idea of, look, if you don't want this so bad, you're going to come off so much more natural because to Kevin's point, it is going to shift the power and it's going to be more of an interview of, are you going to be able to court me so that you get to work with me as opposed to my thought of, God, I really want this listing. But you have to have that mental conversation with yourself first. You have to go through the internal dialogue because you've got those two voices in your head and really get to a spot of calm. And I used to have to do that for myself before I would go into a really high stakes meeting or appointment. And I learned that in corporate America too. We would have to go in and present things to a lot of these C-level executives who scared me to death. And I had to get my mind right. So I think what you have to understand is that everyone goes through this. And a lot of it is you figuring out what's my internal dialogue to get comfortable.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think everything we've talked about today all blends together. We've talked about, being confident when maybe you're not a seasoned broker. We've talked about how to be confident when using scripts and how to learn them and use them. We've talked about being confident in not being salesy and asking those around you, friends, acquaintances, without being disingenuous or without, needing to be authentic. And then we talked about this internal dialogue in terms of not being fearful of rejection, because when you're afraid of rejection, you don't put yourself in the opportunities that present themselves and you miss opportunities. So hopefully these were helpful. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, and going into Friday, we'll see you again tomorrow morning. And watch today. We're going to put together the homework for the week. We know it's been a lot. So watch for the recap of the homework. Hopefully you're putting yourselves in a position to learn those scripts about platform, to learn and review the scripts that we talked about from the perfect listing presentation. And thank you for joining us again. Fill up your cup of coffee.
Thanks,
and thanks, Amy.
Have a good one.